Welcome to Forthright. As of this morning, Monday, March 6th, House Bill 1333 is listed as on the floor calendar for the Washington State House of Representatives and on track for a second reading. It's still alive, and I still can't find anything nice to say about it. Here's what I said about it in a column published March 2nd, 2023 in the Spokesman Review. Headline, HB 1333 and the Church of Wokeism. In a classic 1969 Monty Python sketch, a young Michael Palin bursts in on a proper British couple to announce, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition." If HB 1333 makes it to Governor Jay Inslee's desk, don't be surprised to find Attorney General Bob Ferguson's inquisitors knocking at your door. What's the connection between a 500-year-old culture war in Spain and HB 1333 establishing a Washington Domestic Violent Extremism Commission? Self-righteous certainty as a cover for consolidating political power. It plays out in disingenuous claims of using public health-style approaches to address potentially dangerous disinformation, misinformation, or hate speech using community-led and evidence-based solutions. Except Ferguson, in drafting this legislation, only includes relevant stakeholders as determined by the Attorney General and his congregation. And those evidence-based solutions will not likely be drawn from the body of work of conservative academics like Thomas Sowell, because that evidence doesn't fit the narrative. The Attorney General and his carefully limited commission will determine what qualifies as part of the canon for this religious test of loyalty to the state. HB 1333 is based on Ferguson's 2022 domestic terrorism study. If this was about protecting the community from organized groups carrying AR-15s in public, the Attorney General would have said something when the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club was patrolling in Seattle in the summer of 2020. Videos went viral, and the far-left Daily Beast was proudly reporting on the rise of leftist gun clubs in the halcyon days of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone before it changed its name to CHOP and people started getting killed. While there are legitimate public concerns about violence coming from the far fringes, the last paragraph from the 2022 study concludes, quote, "There is little evidence that state-based efforts to combat domestic terrorism have been effective in light of the federal government's jurisdiction over all significant cases, and for the propensity of these types of state efforts to be misused against social justice advocates," end quote. So it would seem we don't need a new commission when we already have law enforcement sharing information through the Washington State Fusion Center, operating under the Department of Homeland Security since 2002. While there is a working definition under federal law for the term domestic terrorist, HB 1333 goes further by adopting the catch-all domestic violent extremist to attempt to, quote, "combat disinformation and misinformation." The very last sentence of the 2022 study, the rationale for writing HB 1333, says, quote, "The state policy landscape is ripe for innovative thinking on community-based efforts to prevent domestic terrorism and inoculate against disinformation," end quote. To inoculate brings to mind vaccination, and indeed HB 1333 uses the used-to-be-friendly sounding phrase public health style in developing a response. We've seen public health style include shutting down schools, businesses, churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques. The image of public health has been tarnished by 3 years of misinformation, disinformation, and manipulation, and now it's being used as a shield for Ferguson's Inquisition. Misinformation refers to spreading false information, whether or not there is an intent to mislead. Like the recent letter to the editor claiming Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers had renamed the House Energy and Commerce Committee. False. The oldest committee in Congress, it received that name in 1981 to recognize the importance of energy. Was there intent to mislead, to score political points, or an innocent mistake? Might be reportable under the new Inquisition. But surely we'd all like to be protected from disinformation, commonly defined as the use of deliberately misleading or biased information, or a manipulated narrative. But heck, that sounds like every political campaign, news release, or social media post declaring the day's wonderfulness or excoriating an opponent. Even a simple news story is manipulative in the choice of what to tell and how to tell it, questions asked and questions avoided. Who gets to decide when statements are misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech? In a free society, it is the one who hears it. Under HB 1333, it's the government, and that's not kosher. Oh, is somebody going to be triggered because a Gentile culturally appropriated the word kosher? HB 1333 doesn't have a chance at passing constitutional muster. Perhaps it'll be constitutional when pigs fly. Or wait, that might irritate pig farmers, although the ones I know have a good sense of humor. Snowball's Chanson Hill? Probably get me labeled a global warming denier. John McWhorter warned us about the dangers of losing the separation of church and state in his recent book, Woke Racism: How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. And if you understand how badly Chinese immigrants were treated under the law in the 19th century in the name of public health and protecting the public good, you'll protest to your legislators against HB 1333 while protesting government actions is still allowed, before the church of wokeism turns a sincere concern for justice into an inquisition. So I really like my editor, the one who lays out the opinion page before kicking it up the next level in the production, and she does a good job of balancing the politics. She says she can tell because she gets flack from both sides for playing favorites with the other side. And when she read my column as submitted, she felt bad about not catching the error on the name of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has not changed. Newspapers and other legacy media are piling on an increasing workload onto fewer staff, and fact-checking, even in letters to the editor, is a matter of caveat lector. Let the reader beware. House Bill 1333 was introduced by Representative Ramos, a Democrat from Issaquah, at the request of Attorney General Bob Ferguson. And as the AG's 2022 study already noted, law enforcement is working together on intercepting physical violence through the fusion centers, and the report included concerns that the fusion centers need to be monitored more closely for efficacy. I'd never heard of them. From the website for the Washington Fusion Center, quote, "Fusion centers are state-owned and operated centers that serve as focal points in states and major urban areas for the receipt, analysis, gathering, and sharing of threat-related information between state, local, tribal, and territorial, federal, and private sector partners," end quote. So we're already taking care of that kind of domestic terrorism as defined by the federal government, and the federal government defines domestic terrorism as a specific intent crime covering activities that involve acts dangerous to human life, that are a violation of the criminal law of the United States or of any state, and appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion. Okay, I've got no problem with that. That's a decent definition, and there is no state definition, so the federal definition applies. But the AG's report goes on to say, and I quote, "Although this is a useful working definition, because the statutory term domestic terrorism necessarily includes acts dangerous to human life, it fails to capture the full scope of the problem Washington State faces, which encompasses other forms of extremist and political violence, threats, coercion, and intimidation, online disinformation, extremist recruitment and government infiltration efforts, and the general spread of extreme white supremacist, anti-government, and other ideologies." Okay, the inclusion of online disinformation in the middle of that paragraph is a problem. But it goes on to say that based on this, consistent with the approach taken by FBI and DHS, we describe this problem, the online disinformation, using the umbrella term domestic violent extremism. The report also cites that 26 states and the District of Columbia have terrorism statutes that explicitly or implicitly cover acts of domestic terror, and it mentions Idaho as one of those states with a terrorism statute, so I looked it up. Consulting Idaho Code, Chapter 81, the Terrorist Control Act, it uses the federal definition of domestic terror, which is focused on physical violence, which is what most of us think of when we're thinking of a terrorist incident. Idaho legislators in 2022 proposed a number of changes to that state's terror laws, most notably by adding a definition of domestic terrorist and specifically limiting that definition to individuals actually convicted of the crime of terrorism within the state, which the sponsors argued will, quote, "prevent an Idahoan from being labeled a domestic terrorist or terrorist in Idaho without constitutionally protected due process," end quote. No such concerns have been expressed about the Washington law, which which expands the list of domestic terrorists to include someone who posts online misinformation. So, we already have a committee-style system, the fusion centers, in place to deal with the legal definition of domestic terrorism, the physical violence. HB 1333 is written so broadly it could be applied to any speech which the government disapproves of, and that is truly tyranny. In my opinion, HB 1333 is driven by the wokeism that already suppresses speech without help from the government in the form of cancel culture. The report is full of currently fashionable buzzwords and phrases like public health style responses and community-based framework, which is interesting because Inslee rejected a community-based framework for riparian protection when he torpedoed HB 1722, the subject of a previous column and commentary, because it didn't give the executive branch control like he wanted. And championing evidence-based solutions while ignoring evidence on the effectiveness of natural immunity compared to COVID vaccinations with endless boosters, it's really hard to take a commitment to evidence-based solutions seriously. The Church of Wokeism sets a bad precedent. The Church of Wokeism sets a bad precedent for the value of free speech, with a chilling effect on anyone who speaks against or questions the accepted narratives. Most people will just self-censor to avoid being yelled at, literally or figuratively. Now the impulse to censor is moving out of the public square and into state legislatures with Washington's HB 1333. But this impulse from lawmakers to suppress free speech isn't just a blue state problem. A state senator in the red state of Florida has introduced a bill requiring bloggers who write about elected officials to register as lobbyists if they are paid for their work. Somebody must have written something that state senator didn't like. If I were ever to write about Florida politics, which I just did, and that bill passed in Florida, which is unlikely, and were upheld as constitutional, even more unlikely, then I'd have to register as a lobbyist because I write about politics and I accept subscription pledges on my Substack page. If HB 1333 passes, the first complaint I'll be filing will be on State Senator Mankadingra for claiming that the data support her block of what was essentially a weakened bipartisan bill to fix the problems caused when the police pursuit options were drastically limited in the last legislature. The two children, a 6 and an 8-year-old, who were recently killed in the Yakima area by a drunk driver who could not be pursued by police because merely speeding is not a pursuable offense. Senator Dingra is clearly sharing misinformation, if not downright disinformation, online for political purposes. The closing reference in my column to America's historical treatment of Chinese immigrants came to mind because of an old idiomatic phrase. Some folks might take offense at it, but in historical context, it expresses an important truth. The full sentence in the paragraph went like this: HB 1333 doesn't have a Chinaman's chance at passing constitutional muster, meaning no chance at all. And indeed, the Chinese Exclusion Acts and all manner of apartheid-style legislation on the West Coast restricting their opportunities should have made it impossible for the early Chinese immigrants who built the Western railroads to have succeeded in reaching the American dream, and yet they proudly persevered. My editor was right. Out of its historical context, it might be taken as a slur. It was unnecessary to the whole point of the column, and I agreed to the deletion. That's a reasonable conversation to have. It's not censorship, but I still have the right under the First Amendment to tell it to you today. I'll be expecting the Inquisition to knock down my door any minute now. Maybe they'll torture me in the comfy chair. And I apologize for the Monty Python references, but I just can't accept HB 1333 as anything other than a joke. There are links to the sketches and all the background information on the Substack page. Read for yourself. See if you agree. Let me know if you disagree. On this particular column, I got a lot of people agreeing, and those who disagreed had no reason to defend HB 1333. They just disagreed because I didn't like it, so therefore they liked it. That's a really bad way to be making decisions. Like, follow, and subscribe on the Substack to get updates on new material, and thank you for listening.